This is the Spartan warrior society. Sparta was known as Lacedaemon, an ancient Greek city-state located primarily in the present-day region of southern Greece called Laconia. The population of Sparta consisted of three main groups: the Spartans, or Spartiates, who were full citizens; the Helots, who were serfs or slaves; and the Perioeci, who were neither slave nor citizens. That word means dwellers around, and they usually worked as craftsmen and traders and built weapons for the Spartans. So Sparta was a warrior society in ancient Greece that reached the height of its power after defeating their rival city-state of Athens in the Peloponnesian War. Their Spartan culture, so this is where we start looking at their foundation. What made them into a warrior culture that has not been, didn't exist before, nor has it existed after. And it's due to this foundation that was embodied in their society. So Spartan culture was centered on loyalty to the state and military service. At the age of 7, Spartan boys entered a rigorous state-sponsored education, military training, and socialization program known as the Agage. The system emphasized duty, discipline, and endurance. Although Spartan women were not active in the military, they were educated and enjoyed more status and freedom than other Greek women. Because Spartan men were professional soldiers, all manual labor was done by the slave class, the Helots. Despite their military prowess, however, the Spartans' dominance was short-lived, as in 371 BC they were defeated by Thebes at the Battle of Leuctra, and their empire went into a long period of decline. But the word Spartan means self-restrained, simple, frugal, and austere. So what about Spartans in mythology? In Greek mythology, the founder of the city, Lacedaemon, was the son of Zeus, who gave his name to the region and his wife's name to the city. Sparta was an important member in the Greek forces which participated in the Trojan War. Indeed, the Spartan king, Menelaus, instigated the war after the Trojan prince Paris abducted his wife Helen, offered to Paris by the goddess Aphrodite, as a prize for choosing her in a beauty contest with fellow goddess Athena and Hera. Helen is said to have been, So Helen is said to have been the most beautiful in Greece, and Spartan women in general enjoyed a reputation not only for good looks but spirited independence. All healthy male Spartan citizens participated in the compulsory state, as I said, the Agage, emphasizing obedience, endurance, courage, self-control. Spartan men devoted their lives to military service and lived communally well into adulthood. A Spartan was taught that loyalty to the state came before everything else, including one's family. Any child that was found, okay, enough of you. Okay, so any child that was found sickly or deformed would have been left to the elements to die, as the Spartans didn't want to be guilty of infanticide. Their mindset was, we didn't kill you, the elements killed you. Much like Stalin's reign of communism, but different subject. So the Helots, whose names means captives, were also fellow Greeks, originally from Laconia, and Messina, who had been conquered by the Spartans and turned into slaves. The Spartan way of life would not have been possible without the Helots, who handled all the day-to-day tasks and unskilled labor, requiring them to keep the society function. These were the farmers, domestic servants, nurses, and military attendants. The Spartans themselves, they estimate 9,000 strong in Sparta alone, and they were outnumbered by the Helots. But the Spartans often treated these Helots brutally and oppressively in order to prevent uprisings. The Spartans would humiliate the Helots by doing such things as forcing them to get drunk on wine and then make fools of themselves in public, and then use this as a demonstration to young people how adult Spartans should never act, as their self-control was considered a prized trait. A method of mistreatments of the Helots could be far more extreme. Spartans were allowed to kill Helots for being too smart or too fit, probably because they didn't want competition. The Helots could keep a percentage of produce they cultivated, but they were also regularly purged to keep them firmly in their social place, and they could be conscripted into military duties in time of war. So the historian Xenophon says that Sparta was everywhere admired and nowhere imitated. So the relationship between citizens and Helots was an uneasy one, and there were uprisings, notably in the 7th century BC, which contributed to Sparta's defeat to Argos at Hysiae in 669 BC. Sparta gained revenge on Argos in 540 BC, but then lost a battle to Tegea shortly thereafter. Sorry, a lot of history, but it helps to build the context. So the regional instability brought about the Peloponnesian League, 505 to 365 BC, which was a grouping of Corinth, Elis, Tegea, and other states, but never Argos, where each member swore to have the same enemies and allies as Sparta. Membership of the League did not necessitate the paying of tribute to Sparta, but rather the provision of troops. The League would also allow Sparta to establish hegemony over and dominate the Peloponnesian League until the 4th century. In addition to local politics, from the 6th century BC, Sparta would begin to broaden her horizons, for example, by creating an alliance with Croesus of Lydia and sending an expedition against Polycrates of Samos in 520 BC, or 525 BC. The reason this is important because it leads up to a very important battle, but it explains why the Spartans were there. So we know that Sparta had a rivalry with other states. So Sparta, under their king Cleomenes from 520 to 490 BC, overthrew the tyrants of Athens, but the resulting democracy put a stop to any Spartan ambitions in the city. Sparta was, however, an ally with Athens in the defense of Greece against the invasion of Xerxes. And they fought with distinction at Thermopylae in 480 and at Plataea 1 year later. So even though Sparta had rivalry with Athens and other city-states of Greece in times of war, they would put aside those differences to fight their common enemy, and once that was done, they would go back to fighting themselves. But understanding the context of how, because of the Spartans' warrior class, typically leadership of the Peloponnesian League fell to them. So from 480 to 460 BC, regional rivalries and revolts by the Helots damaged Sparta, and worse, were to follow a rivalry with Athens developed into the Peloponnesian Wars from 460 to 446 BC, and picking up again in 431 to 404 BC. The long wars themselves were damaging to both sides, but Sparta, with some Persian help, finally won the conflict when Lysander destroyed the Athenian fleet at Aegospotami in 405 BC. So this helped establish Sparta's position as the #1 city-state in Greece, but this is to be short-lived. So what about Spartan government? Well, the Spartan political system was unusual in that it had two hereditary kings from separate families. These monarchs were particularly powerful when one of them led the army on campaign. The kings were also priests of Zeus, and they sat on the council of elders known as the Gerousia. This body consisted of 28 over 60 years of age males who held the position for life. The Gerousia led the citizen assembly, probably proposing issues on which to vote, and it was also the highest court in Sparta. The assembly, or ecclesia as we would understand it, met once a month and was open to all citizens who voted by the simple method of shouting. There was also an executive committee of 5 ephors chosen by lot from the citizen body, able only to serve for a maximum 1 year, and who were ineligible for future office. They are very wise. We should adopt that. Okay.
You were saying that the council of elders there, you had to be at least 60 to serve on, but what was the life expectancy of people back then? 60 sounds really old.
It is, and it was very rare for Spartan soldiers to reach that. But they did reach it. In fact, Leonidas himself was on that council. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I just looked it up. So life expectancy for Spartans were like 35 years of age.
Well, but I mean, they're not all dying. I mean,
No,
those who make it through the wars, yeah. Where was I? Okay, future office. So 2 of the ephors were also accompanied by one of the kings when on campaign. Just how these different political elements interacted is not known for certain, but clearly a degree of consensus was necessary for the state apparatus to function, and it also helps to explain Sparta's reputation as being a conservative state, slow to make decisions in foreign policy. The reason I bring that up is because how they handle their foreign policy, especially this comment about them being slow to make decisions, will also affect how they behave militarily, which is the next point. What about the Spartan military? So unlike such Greek city-states as Athens, which was a center for arts, learning, and philosophy, Sparta was centered on a warrior culture. Male Spartan citizens were allowed only one occupation, soldier. Indoctrination into this lifestyle began early. Spartan boys started their military training at the age of 7 when they left home and entered the agage. The boys lived communally under austere conditions. They were subjected to continued physical competitions, which could include violence. They were given meager rations and expected to become skilled at stealing food, among other survival skills. The teenage boys who demonstrated the most leadership potential were selected for participation in the Krypteia, which acted as a secret police force whose primary goal was to terrorize the general Helot population and murder those who were troublemakers. So at age 20, Spartan males became full-time soldiers and remained on active duty until the age of 60. The Spartans' constant military drilling and discipline made them skilled at the ancient Greek style of fighting in the phalanx formation. In the phalanx, the army worked as a unit in close, deep formation and made coordinated mass maneuvers. No one soldier was considered superior to the other. Going into battle, a Spartan soldier, or a hoplite as they were called, wore a large bronze helmet, breastplate, ankle guards, and carried a round shield made of bronze and wood, a long spear, and a sword. Spartan warriors were also known for their long hair and their red cloaks. Apparently the red cloaks red was considered a manly color. I kind of was thinking more it was like a line with Deadpool where, hey, this is why I wear red, so the bad guys can't see me bleed, but, who knows. So a peculiar feature of the Spartans and their military was great importance given matters of religion. As Herodotus puts it, they considered the things of the gods more weighty than the things of men. Pre- and post-battle sacrifices were a common feature of Greek warfare in general, but the Spartan army took things one step further and sacrificed before crossing rivers, for example, and even withheld from mobilizing the army if an important religious festival was ongoing. Famous episodes where the Spartans put religion above warfare and even national crisis were Marathon and Thermopylae during the Persian Wars. In the former battle, the Battle of Marathon, they arrived too late to participate, and in the Battle of Thermopylae, they mobilized only a token force as they felt compelled to first celebrate the Carnia festival in honor of Apollo. The Spartan hoplite army, however, showed the rest of Greece the way forward towards greater military professionalism and considered the iconic image of fearless and disciplined hoplites with red cloaks and lambda and blazed shields for the Greeks, admiring Romans and even 21st century filmgoers, that this was Sparta. What about Spartan women and marriage? Well, women in Sparta had a better lot in life than other Greek city-states. In Sparta, they could own property, which they often gained through dowries and inheritance. In fact, women became amongst the richest members of society, as most often than not, their men were killed in many of the wars, and eventually controlled 2/5 of the Spartan land. In addition, Spartan women could also move around with reasonable freedom. They enjoyed athletics and could even drink wine. All these freedoms would have been unacceptable in other Greek city-states. Spartan women had a reputation for being independent-minded and enjoyed more freedom and power than their counterparts. They played no role in the military, but female Spartans often received formal education, although separate from the males, and not at boarding schools. So their education was more geared towards attracting mates. They were encouraged to engage in athletic competitions, including javelin throwing, wrestling, singing, and dancing competitively. As adults, Spartan women were allowed to own and manage property, although they were typically unencumbered by domestic responsibilities such as cooking, cleaning, and making clothing. Those tasks were handled by the slave class of helots. Marriage was important to Spartans, as the state put pressure on people to have male children who would grow up to become citizen warriors and replace those who died in battle. Men who delayed marriage were publicly shamed, while those who fathered multiple sons could be rewarded. In preparation for marriage, Spartan women had their heads shaved. I don't know why, I couldn't find a reason, but they kept their hair short after they wed. Married couples typically lived apart, as men under 30 were required to continue residing in the communal barracks. In order to see their wives during this time, husbands often had to sneak away at night. According to Herodotus, the wife of Leonidas, Gorgo, even asked her husband when he was about to leave for battle, what should she do should he not return? And his response to her was simple: marry a good man, have a good life, and bear many sons. It was also reported to be a common saying for Spartan women to tell the Spartan men, with your shield or on it. The implication was, don't come back without it. Because ideally, or in theory, if they came back without their shield, it means they were cowardly and they dropped their shield to run faster. So you either return with it in hand or you're on it, meaning you died in battle and your compatriots are carrying your body back for burial. There were foreigners, get the root of the word xenophobe from Greece, which is xeno, So there were foreigners in Spartan society, but they were not as welcome as other city-states. Athens was actually more welcoming towards foreigners than Sparta. But those that did live in Sparta were sometimes forcibly expelled by their overly suspicious and often paranoid host. Like all Greek societies, Sparta was dominated by male citizens, and the most powerful of those came from a select group of families. These were landed in aristocracy and followed reforms credited to Lycurgus in 6th century BC. Citizens could not indulge in agricultural activities. This was the lot of helots, and they had to devote themselves to athletic and military training and politics. They continued that reform with saying that helots could not own property and could not rise to become full citizens. And this lack of social mobility, unfortunately, would also come back to haunt Sparta later. Oh, come on, since I can't use my mouse. Okay, there we go. So, reduced by constant warfare, in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, the Spartan hoplites would become dangerously small in number, 8,000 in 490 BC to only 700 in 371 BC. So a dramatic drop in the number of Spartan soldiers. So much that non-Spartan soldiers had to be enlisted, and their loyalty and interest in Sparta's ambition was questionable. Hence why Spartan soldiers were raised in Iagage to ensure that they were loyal to Sparta. And so, continuing our historical overview, we have the decline of Sparta. So their ambitions continue in central and northern Greece, Asia Minor, and Sicily, which again drags them into another protracted conflict, the Corinthian Wars with Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and Persia from 396 to 387. And the result of the conflict was the King's Peace, where Sparta ceded her empire, for which, in any case, she lacked the necessary bureaucratic apparatus to manage it properly anyways, to Persian control, but Sparta was left to dominate Greece. However, trying to crush Thebes, Sparta lost the crucial battle of Leuctra in 371 BC against the brilliant Theban general Epaminondas. Thebes then annexed parts of Messina, and Sparta became thereby only a second-rate power. And then after briefly challenging Macedonian control in the 3rd century and besieged by Perphas in 272 BC, Sparta never regained her former glory, and she was compelled to join the Achaean Confederacy in 195 BC. And then under Roman control, Sparta was permitted to leave the Confederacy in 147 BC, which then prompted another war. However, as a free city in the Roman world, things did improve for Sparta, and the city enjoyed good relations with her conquerors, but the end finally came for Sparta in 396 AD, when the Visigoth king Alaric sacked the city. And then up more into the present day, in 1834, Otto, the king of Greece, ordered the founding of the modern-day town of Sparta on the site of ancient Sparta. So now backtracking, so now we got like a historical overview of their government, their politics, and their rise and demise. So now we're going to step back and we're going to focus on the Battle of Thermopylae. So thanks in part to the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC, in which a small force of Spartan soldiers stayed behind to fight to the death against a vastly larger Persian force. The warriors of Sparta have long been famous for their military prowess and tenacity, and even today, the word Spartan conjures up images of an awesomely fit, skillful fighter, indifferent to pain and fear. One writer says other Greek city-states had fine armies, but Sparta was recognized by most as the best. So how did they achieve this? Well, we know that one factor was the Agage, the Greek city-state's educational and training system. So according to ancient Greek historian Plutarch, who wrote several centuries after Sparta's heyday in the 400s BC, Spartans began developing soldiers shortly after when male infants were evaluated by Spartan elders. The well-built and sturdy children were allowed to live, while those who were deemed unhealthy or deformed were left at the foot of the mountain to die. We know that at the age of 7, Spartan boys were turned over by their parents to the state, where they were organized into companies that lived, studied, and trained together. We know that the boy who excelled in judgment and was the most courageous, Plutarch writes, the boy who excelled in judgment and was most courageous in fighting was made captain of the company. The rest all kept their eyes on him, obeying his orders and submitting to his punishments, so that their training was a practice of obedience. So Plutarch portrays Spartan boys as receiving little schooling, but Stephen Hawkinson, a professor of ancient history at the University of Nottingham in the UK, says that there are hints in other sources that Spartan boys received the standard Greek elementary education in reading, writing, numbers, song, and dance. To toughen them up even more, Spartan boys were compelled to go barefoot and seldom bathed or used ointments, so that their skin became hard and dry. Plutarch wrote, for clothing, they were given just one cloak to wear year-round, to make them learn to endure heat and cold, and make their own beds from plants that they had to rip out of the ground with their bare hands. According to Plutarch, as young Spartan boys grew, they were required to exercise more and more to build their bodies. As Donald Kyle notes in his book, Sports and Spectacle in the Ancient World, Spartan youth had to present themselves for regular inspection, and boys who didn't look sufficiently fit were flogged. In addition to foot races and wrestling, their sports included a particular brutal contest in which two teams would try to drive each other off an island by pushing, kicking, biting, and gouging their opponents. To make life even tougher, Xenophon also continues, to make life even tougher, the Spartan boys were fed a meager diet to keep them slim. Lycurgus, the founder of the Spartan system, believed would make them grow taller, but the boys' hunger was intended to embolden them to steal food from gardens and other places in order to make the boys more resourceful in getting supplies and better fighting men. So they were encouraged, they weren't encouraged to steal just for stealing, but they were taught to steal for survival and just don't get caught. So if you were caught stealing, there was punishment. And they even turned it into an annual ritual in which boys who got caught stealing were flogged publicly. But as part of an ancient ritual, they even set up like a little game where Spartan boys would try to steal cheese from the temple altar, which would require them to evade guards armed with whips. And this was considered a test of courage. And the boys themselves looked forward to the public display. So the Agage, as Paul Cartledge writes, was a trial by ordeal. But it was a vital step towards being selected for one of the messes, the communal dining groups, and becoming a full-fledged Spartan citizen and soldier. So strictly speaking, the Agage itself didn't include military training, which didn't start until they became adult soldiers. Its real focus was to prepare the Spartan males to be compliant members of society who were ready to sacrifice their all for Sparta. But unlike other Greek city-states, Sparta was exceptional in its socio-political stability. And part of the reason was that the boys' upbringing had instilled behavior that encouraged harmony and cooperation. but their emphasis on fitness did help the Spartan soldiers on the battlefield. It made them tougher, stronger, and more able to sustain the weight of the heavier shields, especially during the summer months. And it also allowed them to be better at pushing and shoving and increase stamina. So they weren't super soldiers, but they were at the peak of physical conditioning. So their real secret wasn't their physical fitness. I mean, that was only part of it. And it wasn't their indifference to pain and suffering, but rather their superior organization. They drilled relentlessly until they could execute tactics with perfection. And we see that with pretty much all militaries, where you drill and drill until it becomes second nature. Oftentimes you do things without even actually thinking about it because your muscles just behave. So this gave them essentially a tactical advantage on the battlefield. Xenophon says that a Spartan army could perform maneuvers that others couldn't because of their training. According to Plutarch, Spartans continued regular military training throughout their adult lives. No man was allowed to live as he pleased, but in their city and in military encampments. And it wasn't until the age of 60 that Spartans were finally allowed to retire from the army, which would probably include that council. So they would retire from the army, but then move right into the council. That they were finally allowed to retire to, provided that they lived that long. So according to according to Hodgkinson, he says that the stability that the Agage fostered also led to a certain inflexibility. For all the Spartans' efficiency, they relied heavily on a limited set of maneuvers, and when these failed, they simply didn't have a plan B. Off the battlefield, the rigid acceptance of the status quo that their educational system enforced made it difficult for Spartans to deal with social problems, such as inequality in land ownership and declining population. And then essentially, another commentator, I only have his last name referenced here, but he says eventually it produced a sort of conceptual lock when Spartans could not imagine any other kind of life, making it difficult for them to accept innovation in war or politics. So in this sense, the regime that helped make the Spartans so tough also contributed to their downfall, such as in 371 BC, where Thebes, a rival city-state, defeated Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra by using unorthodox cavalry maneuvers that the Spartans were inflexible to counter. So now that we've established, a little bit of foundation on their culture, their politics, and military, in order to get an idea of how this culture thinks and behaves, that brings us to essentially the star of the show. We have Leonidas the First. We know that he, unfortunately, very little of his history remains, but we know that he was a Spartan king. He was immortalized in Greek literature and became a legend because of his heroic last stand. Unfortunately, he is a legend without a biographer. Almost nothing is known of his life. The exact date of his birth is unknown, as the particulars of his childhood. Even the spectacular events surrounding his epic struggle in 480 BC are shrouded in mystery and open to controversy. The chief source for Leonidas comes from Herodotus, but even in Herodotus' histories, Leonidas is given very little attention. And so this has forced modern scholars to, critically examine Herodotus' sentences to reconstruct more detail. So understanding Spartan culture and how their military was organized, we know that he was probably born in Spartan territory on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, southern Greece, probably between the years of 530 to 500 BC. He is the son of the Spartan king Okay, I'm gonna skip that one. Sorry. And descended from Greek culture hero Hercules. So all the Spartans believed that they were descended from Hercules. Um, however, during his youth and early manhood, he wasn't actually in line to be king. So when the king, whose name I can't pronounce, when his first wife didn't conceive during her early years of marriage, the Spartan elders compelled him to take a second wife, which was contrary to Spartan custom. The firstborn and only child of that union was a male, Cleomenes, who became heir to the throne, which now excludes Leonidas from the throne. So in the meantime, the first wife conceived 3 sons. Okay, so the second wife had Cleomenes, and the first wife conceived 3, Dorius, Leonidas, and Cleombrotus. So Cleomenes was psychologically impaired, and they believe he's possibly mentally handicapped. Well, Dorius, who would have been heir apparent under more normal circumstances, excelled. However, when the king died, Cleomenes took the throne, but unable to live under his brother's rule, Dorius set sail for the distant lands and embarked on a series of adventures, resulting in his death. So that leaves Leonidas and his brother. So when Cleomenes himself died in 487 and left no male heir, the line of succession suddenly fell on Leonidas. So understanding that he was not in line for the throne tells us that Leonidas, because according to Spartan culture, the male heir of the king did not undergo the agage. They underwent a modified version, but the goal was to prepare them for rulership, not serving the Spartan army. So other than that exemption, everyone else served. This tells us that since Leonidas was not the firstborn heir, he would have undergone the agage. So the line of succession suddenly falls on Leonidas, who had married Cleomenes' daughter and consequently his own half-niece. He was the only one of Spartan's kings. That had two. Okay. So as stated, Sparta exercised the rule of 2 kings. Leonidas became one of those. And during Cleomenes' reign, the second king had been Demaratus, but they had engaged in a feud, and Demaratus had deserted to the Persian Empire. Leo We're just going to call him Leo for short. He succeeded Demaratus. Demaratus would come later under Xerxes' rule, so don't forget about him. So thus, Leonidas ruled according to Spartan tradition in partnership, one of 2 kings. So according to the custom, Leonidas assumed his important position as in the priesthood of his state. All the kings were the priests. And his most important role was that of the commander of the Spartan army. How much time do I got? How much time do I have? Okay. So in matters of war, Spartan king was expected to be the first in the march and the last to retreat. In his youth and early manhood, Leonidas would have received very strenuous physical conditioning, along with many years of military training to hone his warrior skills to the peak of martial perfection. This was the mandatory agenda of the Spartan male in a regime that would last in varying and lessening degrees of severity until the age of 60. So this product of conditioning was probably produced the finest warrior and army in the ancient Greek world. We've already covered how the Spartans carried long thrusting spears, swords, dagger, the round shield, breastplate, leg guards, and then the Spartan hoplites wore the bright red cloaks. So we know that they fought together, shoulder to shoulder, in the phalanx, which means forest of spears, because executed properly, that's what it looks like. You have a row of shields and spears sticking out, and it's almost like a turtle back. It's supposed to be impenetrable. So from the front, the phalanx was pretty much unstoppable, but it was vulnerable to the flanks and rear. And in order to limit their vulnerability, the Spartans deployed more lightly armored javelin troops. So in this form of warfare, the Spartans were unequaled. There is no evidence that they employed archers or slingers, nor did they employ cavalry in significant numbers, for the terrain of Greece also limited mounted action. And then even in terms of naval combat, most of that was left to Sparta's allies. So despite the impressive war machinery behind Leonidas, he might have been nothing more than a name on a list of Sparta's kings, had it not been for the events of 480 BC, which thrust him center stage into King Xerxes and his Persian Empire. We see from the book of Daniel in chapter 8. Now, the prophecy actually is fulfilled later during Alexander the Great's time, but looking at the prophecy and the events of Thermopylae, I believe Thermopylae was the pivot point. It set the stage for the fulfillment of this prophecy. Because without Thermopylae, the rest of the Greek world wouldn't have mobilized against Persia. But it was the victory / defeat at Thermopylae that rallied the rest of Greece to push back. So Daniel's vision is one of the ram and the goat. Beginning in verse 1, it says, "In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision, after one that had already appeared to me. In my vision I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam. In the vision I was beside Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. And one of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. And I watched the ram as he charged towards the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with prominent horns between his eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He came towards the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at him in great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering his 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him. The goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven." Now we know from that horn that was broken was Alexander. I mean, we have history as context to show that, and how when Alexander the Great died, his kingdom was given amongst his 4 generals. So even though Persia's defeat would come, like I said, I kind of think, looking at the evidence, that Thermopylae was that pivot point. It was a defeat that, in terms of military conflict, it was a defeat. But it rallied the rest of Greece to push back. We've already seen historically, like during the Battle of Marathon, where they would, okay, we don't like each other now, but there's a bigger bad guy, so let's focus on him. And why would it be any different? And so even though Thermopylae became a military defeat, I believe that it served to rally the rest of Greek the Greek world behind them. So Daniel continues. He says, I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. The four horns that replace the one that was broken off represent the four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. So stepping back, so we know that that defeat comes during Alexander, but we got to step back a little bit. So by the first year of the 5th century BC, the Persian Empire was under the rule of Darius I. We're all familiar with him, or we should be. His reign was 522 to 486 BC, and he was already expanding into mainland Europe and subjugated Thrace and Macedonia. Next in King Darius's eyes were Athens. For whatever reason, I guess previously they tried to invade Athens. Athens pushed back. Persia's now upset. They want to go after Greece again. And the only way through the terrain of that area of Greece is through Thermopylae. But whatever the reasons that were for prompting Persia's war, we don't know. We assume it's wealth and resources, but there could be other suggestions. So whatever the exact motives, we know that in 491 BC, that Darius sends envoys to call the Greeks for submission to Persian rule, and the Greeks send a no-nonsense reply by executing his envoys. So as was customary, Persian ambassadors would ask for a token of earth and water, but as a token of their submission. And in this case, the Athenians threw the heralds into a pit, while the Spartans characteristically hurled them down a well, suggesting they dig their own earth. So Darius responds to this diplomatic outrage by launching a naval force of 600 ships and 25,000 men to attack the Cyclades and Euboea, leaving Persians just one step away from the rest of Greece. And then in 490 BC, Greek forces led by Athens met the Persians in battle at Marathon and defeated the invaders. The battle would take on mythical status amongst the Greeks, but in reality, it's just the opening overture of a long war with several other battles making up principal acts. Persia, with the largest empire in the world, was vastly superior in men and resources, and these would be fully utilized for a full-scale attack. In 486 BC, Xerxes I became king upon the death of Darius, and massive preparations for invasion were made. Depots of equipment and supplies were laid. They even dug a canal at Chalcodike and a bridge of boats across the Hellespont to facilitate movement of troops. So Greece was about to face its greatest threat ever, and even the oracle at Delphi ominously advised the Athenians to fly to world's end. So 10 years after this, when the Darius' son and the Persian king Xerxes determined to settle the Greek problem once and for all, he assembled his mighty army, which even modern scholarship concedes may have totaled 25 million, and he dispatched a fifth column of spies and diplomats to demand the submission of the Greeks. And this army was well stocked with cavalry. According to historians, Xerxes' army was 25 million. Now, mind you, that's over the breadth of the empire. He didn't commit all of those. Well, it's impossible. No, this is Persia. This is not Sparta. So, yeah, they're estimating that Xerxes had 25 million for his army, Now, something to point out here is that not to say that the Persian army weren't professional soldiers, but not all of them were professional soldiers. A lot of slaves. And who's going to fight harder? The professional soldier defending his homeland on his territory, or a slave that's only fighting because they're told to? And so we're gonna get to a difference in their battle tactics. So he dispatched a fifth column of spies, diplomats, to demand the submission of the Greeks. The army was well stocked with cavalry and had at its core a 10,000-man elite bodyguard known as the Immortals. They had a powerful navy, significantly larger than anything the Greeks could muster. And so the Persian force was centralized, with its only flaw perhaps being that the subjugation of its ethnic units, who may fight on with various degrees of enthusiasm. Like I said, most of them were slaves, whereas the Spartans were freedmen and loyal to Sparta.
But they also enslaved the Helots, and the Helots were pressed into service too. They also had to fight.
Yeah, almost like a militia. Some people say that they were untrained. I don't think so. I think they were trained. They just weren't professional. They weren't full-time soldiers. Okay, so the immensity of the Persian threat compelled Athens and Sparta to set aside their formal rivalries and work together. Athens had her mighty navy and placed herself under Spartan command. This goes back to the Peloponnesian League, where Sparta, as the military structure, typically held that role. So feuding was endemic amongst the Greek states. However, they would So feuding was endemic amongst the Greek states and would disrupt the Greek ability to react, especially in the first few months. In particular, Greek indecision about holding the strategic pass of Tempe resulted in its early abandonment to the Persians. And as Xerxes crossed the Hellespont from Asia Minor, several of the northern Greek states began to defect. And so within the Spartan Council of Elders, there was much debate. And so this is where we kind of establish the age of Leonidas, because he's on this council, which puts him at the age of 60. So within the Spartan Council Elders, there's much debate over which two basic strategies were best. Most dear to the Spartan heart was the stout defense of the Corinth Isthmus, the choke point that led into the Peloponnesian Peninsula. But this act would have surrendered northern and central Greece and thereby greatly reduced the chance for a more united stand. The second option was to block the Persian advance at the pass of Thermopylae. Do I want to stop here, or should I keep going? Yeah, probably. Okay, let's stop there. So we'll stop in mid-thought, but next week I will kind of do like a refresher real quick and then bring us back up to speed.
So the movie holds pretty true to what you read.
To a degree.
I realize you're still a lot of things that you said mirror the movie.
Well, but this is where we're going to start breaking apart the myth from reality. There was more than 300 at Thermopylae. They estimate, I think it was somewhere in the range of 7,000. You had 300 of the elite guard, backed by the Athenians and several other groups. And so, not to get too far ahead, that when the third day of that battle came and Leonidas realized we've been betrayed and Xerxes is moving around the mountain pass and we're essentially getting caught between two groups, he made the decision to order the rest to vacate the area. You go ahead and leave and we will hold. And it was him and 700, I think, Athenians to hold that pass. And their goal was really just to buy time for the rest of the army to get out of there. So although the movie portrays it as 300, really there was more like 1,000 during that last day. So it's a lot of history, brought in a huge chunk of time, but we're trying to build context. Because I'll get back to this whole discipline and foundation part later. In order to understand that, we need to understand the context of what is going on and what led from point A to point B to point C. And so,
If I'm not mistaken, the Thebes had a pretty baller army as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
but the Spartans were considered by far the professional soldiers.
Yeah. I just know that.
Yeah, I mean the Athenians they had their
Totally.
they had their own army. Corinth had their own army. It's just the Spartans were the army. Well, they weren't born to die. They weren't encouraged to go on suicide missions. And we'll see in other battles where, Spartans even technically surrendered. They didn't go into the mindset of, reckless abandonment. Their mindset was discipline and duty.
I'm thinking of the Greek cities as like the Greek city-state as well as the correlation to the god that they serve. Ares was the god of war, and Spartans mostly served him as their main god. So I mean, it would make sense with Ares being the god of war, everything to do with war. They would have that. They would try to follow
But
that.
they were preventing development in the brain. So these children become little, like, thoughtful, trained, obedient killers.
Well, yeah, we would consider it child abuse now, but understanding their training system, the Agagain, how it trained them to survive.
Yeah.
We want you to obey and we want you to survive. And and so then you span that over their entire life. Every day is devotion to the state.
Yeah, it doesn't make their lives, but I'm just saying, it doesn't make their lives or their childhood any less abnormal, but because it's preventing certain development to make them really great killers and soldiers. Like, you don't have, like, if your whole loyalty is for your religion and your country before anybody else, like, and you do this at very young ages, like we see, especially like when people adopt children from like war-torn countries and stuff like that, they're like little sociopaths, and you have like this huge society that's kind of built around that, and it's fascinating to hear about it because they started them right away, and if the kid wasn't good enough,
Yeah.
and it's just I didn't know that about the Spartans. I knew a lot about the Thebes, but it makes sense with a lot of the stuff with the Spartans as well.
And like I've already pointed out, that mindset was good on one hand because that foundation that was literally beaten into them
Yeah.
made them the best soldiers. But on the same token, that would also come to bite them in the hinder parts later. Not just as a society, but as a culture. I mean, Sparta, there's been no culture before or since that was Sparta.
Right. And I haven't seen 300, but I do know of Kirk Douglas, so I don't know how accurate. Yeah.
Well, mind you, 300 was based on a graphic novel,
Right.
and it was meant to tell a story, not necessarily educate.
Educate.
So now that we've established, some understanding of their culture, the events that were going on, their politics, we can see that they are, for their part, very logical people. They weren't mindless soldiers, and so I'm hoping to use that as a lesson on how that foundation and discipline, mind you, theirs was extreme, but how foundation and discipline ultimately lead to something else. But I will pick that up later. Any other questions, comments? Yes, ma'am.
Aaron said that it's a really interesting subject, and thank you.
Okay.
There's also another part where the children, well, being the younger police, they had to find a way to kill at least one of the helots to get into the army
To earn their stripes, so to speak.
to earn, yeah.
And for them, being in that position meant everything. So I mean, think of it in modern times. What most naval officers, for example, they don't join the Navy just to be lowly lieutenants. They join to sit in the captain's chair. And for Spartans, their life was earning that red cloak to identify them not as only as full citizens, but one of this elite brotherhood. And within the Spartan military, because it encompassed all of their males, you could be in ranks and your cousin's there and your brother's there and your father's behind you. I mean, they were almost a big family. So, okay. Anyone else? No? Okay. And we want to do prayers and praises next? Okay. Okay. Brother TJ, would you care to close us?